Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice a week my guests and I offer you our insights on property, on investments, success and money. And today it's that time of the month for our very popular Big Picture episode with Pete Wargent. And together we're going to dissect the multitude of factors currently shaping our housing markets and broader economy. And boy, has there been some news lately that I'm looking forward to sharing with you. So whether you're an investor, a homeowner, or just a curious mind, this monthly deep dive into these factors promises to keep you informed, keeps you ahead of the curve as well. So, without further ado, let's dive right into my conversation with Pete Wargent.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
In these regular Big Picture podcasts, Pete Wargent and I discuss the macroeconomic factors, the big factors affecting our economy, our property markets, and boy, there's a lot to discuss today. There's the new Labor Party initiatives to build 1.2 million homes. There's what's lately happened to the unemployment figures. We're going to talk a bit about interest rates, how you can't get away without discussing interest rates and inflation, rental caps. And I'm looking forward to Pete's thoughts on these. In fact, I'm delighted to have Pete join us once a month. Pete's one of Australia's most respected financial analysts and commentators, and he brings an invaluable expertise to help us navigate this ever-changing landscape of our property markets. Hi, Pete.
A lot can change in a month, Michael. So yeah, it's great to be back on to see what we can talk about today.
Well, there's no shortage of things to talk about today because only a short while ago, the ALP had their talk fest about property and the National Cabinet. Well, the media said they agreed to build 1.2 million new homes in a bid to tackle housing crisis. But that's not what they agreed to at all, Pete. What they agreed to was to pay the states and local councils for all new homes completed. But I'm not sure how that actually translates into actual dwellings. And more importantly, I really don't see how it translates into affordable accommodation or cheaper rents, Pete.
I think if you go back and take a look at what was previously announced, so there was an old target, 1 million homes over 5 years from July 2024, the idea was to boost supply, improve affordability. Labor also campaigned in the election on reducing energy and power bills for households by $275. And of course, they've gone through the roof. It's since been clarified, well, they didn't mean reduce the power bills and energy bills immediately. They meant, well, in a few years' time, effectively as clean energy comes on and renewables, I mean, look, the big picture here is that when a government has been in place for some time and Labour is in opposition for some time, it takes a long time for the new government to get up to speed. And we saw this in England, actually. The Labour Party was out of power for years and years, and they were just got used to being in opposition. And when Tony Blair won the election, they were, for the first term, really just accused of what was called initiative-itis. And they thought, instead of actually putting policies in place that changed things, they could just make a media release, make an announcement, control the media narrative, and that would get the job done. So it's a little bit like that at the moment. So the general idea here is states and territories can get a new home bonus if they help to reach this updated target of 1.2 million new homes over 5 years. That's what the National Cabinet's agreed. But as you said, there's nothing here that actually changes the problem. That would equate to, 240,000 homes per annum for 5 years, which was never done before. There was 1 year, actually, where we got up to that level, as you remember, during the big apartment boom down there in Melbourne, also in Sydney and Brisbane. But normally we don't build anything like that. And there's nothing here that really explains, well, how? Where are the tradies going to come from? Where will the materials come from? What about the planning constipated system? How does that get freed up? So just making a media release saying, oh, we've upped the target from 1 million to 1.2 million. Well, nothing's actually changed. And electorates will put up with that for a period of time, but if they want to serve for a second term, eventually people will want to start seeing results as well.
Well, they're encouraging state governments and also councils. And councils can approve more properties being built. Planning system regulations can be loosened up. They can now start to regulate for some more medium density accommodation, which is what's been proposed. But it's really only private builders and property owners who can decide how fast they get built. Are they getting built? Are they getting financed? And one of the challenges is there's not enough rental accommodation. And just the thought that they're going to build a whole lot of new homes and maybe some first home buyers are going to go into it, that's not going to bring enough rental accommodation in for all the migrants, many of them being students, short-term visa holders who are not going to want to buy new properties, Pete.
No, if you think back to when we actually did that one occasion where dwelling completions got up to, I think it was about 220,000 or so. It was around about sort of 2017, 2018. There's all those new apartments were completed. Well, if you think back, there was a real range of issues, poor quality. There was, tens of thousands of units had issues. There was cracks, there was leaks. There was even some tower blocks that, effectively were unsafe. There was flammable cladding. There was defects, balcony issues. So that was just the one time when we had a big apartment construction boom. And the first thing I thought when I saw the media release is, well, what about quality versus quantity? It's all well and good to say we're going to build 1.2 million dwellings in 5 years, but where will they be built? What will be built? Who's going to do it? How are they going to do this without creating massive inflation in construction costs? So we've already seen construction costs are up 33% since the start of 2020. Well, it's going to start trying to increase dwelling completions to the highest level in Australia's history. Well, how's that going to come about without creating sort of renewed inflation like home builder the first time around? So there's lots of unanswered questions here that a media release doesn't tackle.
Definitely. Well, actually, it was a bit more than the media release. It was a real big talk fest. But interestingly, there have been lots of media releases, and one of them was the Grattan Institute came out and said, fantastic, build all these houses, and that will decrease rents by 4% or maybe even 8%. Why would that happen? Because there's still not the incentive for property investors to get into the market. There's more and more disincentives because of the uncertainty. And sure, the build to rent segment is going to bring on more accommodation. But as we've said before, that's not cheap. That's not affordable accommodation in general because of the quality that these landlords are going to build because they want to keep them in the long term. It's going to be more expensive accommodation and not necessarily in areas where affordable accommodation even needs to be.
I think what build to rent might be able to do is by shifting some of the demand into long-term leases, it might just free up potentially more rentals elsewhere in the market. But I mean, if we take a look at my hometown or home country, United Kingdom, where build to rent has really taken off over a number of years now, well, rental price growth this month just hit the highest level on record. So as you said, there's more to this than just kicking off some build to rent apartments and problem solved. And actually, it looks increasingly like it's going to be down your way where there's real issues in the rental market. The rental vacancies have effectively halved from a year ago. Asking rents are up another 1.7% last month. Lots of talk about things like rent caps, rent freezes, changes to tenancy rights. All of these things, whether or not they come to pass, it's just creating a lack of confidence for an investor. It really needs to make a 5 or 10 year decision. And with all these proposed changes, it's very hard to do that. Asking rents in Melbourne are now the highest increase year on year in the nation, over 20%. Yeah, look, modelling can be tortured to sort of produce whatever result you want. But at the moment, there's not really much happening that's going to take the pressure off, at least in some of those capital city markets where the migrants like to go.
Well, new homes could be built reasonably quickly, 10 months to a year. But where we get the apartments or dwellings in bulk is apartment buildings, whether they're medium or high density ones, and they take quite a number of years to get through from concept to completion. And recently, Mirvac suggested that in 2025, there's only going to be 15,000 apartments being completed. And that's in a country where we're getting an annual immigration of 400,000 people or more a year. But the other problems I see, Peter, if we're going to build all these homes, what about the infrastructure? And it's not just the infrastructure that people think about, like roads and shopping centres, but the soft infrastructure. If we got all these people, what about the schools? What about the hospitals? What about the aged care? Lots of issues. And what about social housing and affordable housing? There really wasn't a proper discussion about those.
No, I think if you look at the share of public housing or public sector housing being built, there was just one period during the Rudd stimulus where there was a bit of a spike, but otherwise an uninterrupted downtrend over the past few decades. Neither side of politics is keen on actually taking control and the government building housing. And actually, a lot of it gets demolished over time anyways. It becomes obsolete. So on a net basis, we're not really adding any public housing or affordable housing is only a very small slither of the market. So yeah, not much being tackled there. I think other countries that have gone down the high population growth route, including Canada, the UK, they do find that you're right. If you don't build new infrastructure, like, for example, hospitals, then eventually they get overwhelmed as you get the increase in demand. Well, if you're going to bring in population growth of 500,000, you're going to need more hospitals, more schools, more service stations, more shopping centres. And that is actually part of the challenge at the moment. Infrastructure is actually being built at a very fast rate, but that's actually taking a lot of the labour supply away from residential construction. So hence some of the shortages that we're seeing. So yeah, there's lots of questions, not many answers. And the big picture is, population growth of say 2.2 million over the next 5 years. That's a hell of a lot of housing we've got to build in a short period of time.
Of course, one of the things that came out of this talkfest was that all parties, other than the Greens, said there's not going to be rent freezes or rent caps. And in Victoria, only a couple of weeks ago, Dan Andrews said everything's on the table, including those. But he came out and said that rent freezes and rent caps are no longer going to be considered. And in fact, Philip Lowe, in one of his last speeches to Parliament, suggested that as well. Now, the other interesting thing in the news over the last little while, Pete, was the unemployment figures, because each month we have a bit of a chat about what's going to happen to interest rates, what's going to happen to inflation. And it seems that things are heading in the right direction for the Reserve Bank not to raise interest rates again, especially with the latest unemployment figures ticking up just a little bit, even though the Australian Bureau of Statistics suggested there could have been other factors, including holidays, that were should have been taken into account with this.
That's right. There's always the sample rotation to take into account. It's a new financial year. So from 1 July, the restrictions on student visa holders to a 48-hour working week were reinstated. Remember, that was taken away for a while. So some economists thought, well, with that happening, and as those newly freed up positions come online, workers jostling for new positions could see employment up about 40,000 or so in July. In the event, it actually fell by about 15,000. Full-time employment was down nearly 25,000. So, I mean, that's a very soft monthly result. And as you said, you've got to look at this stuff on a trend basis rather than the monthly numbers, which can be pretty noisy. But yeah, look, over the year, employment's still up actually nearly 3%. Close to 400,000 gains. So, that's a thumping rebound from where things were during COVID. But don't forget, as you said, immigration's running at record highs. The working age population actually increased by nearly 600,000 over the past year. So unemployment's now rising. So in July, if you take the unrounded figures, unemployment went from 3.46 to 3.71. So that's the highest now we've seen in about 14 months. So yes, there was a period there when you remember you went to the cafes, the restaurants, there were signs up everywhere. No staff, can't open, staff shortages. Yeah. Well, that's kind of gone now. Unemployment's starting to rise. Wages growth looks like it's peaked out at around 3.6%, or average weekly earnings up about 3.9%. So we don't have the same issues that, for example, they have in the UK, where earnings growth is now 7.8%. That's just not happened in Australia. And that labour force slack is now starting to increase. So looks like wages growth will peak at somewhere around where it is, about 4% or so. The unemployment rate will now start to rise. Now, paradoxically, this is actually quite good news for the Reserve Bank because it shows the economy is responding to rising interest rates, spending is slowing down, employment's calming down. We're getting a bit less pressure on some of those capacity constraints and shortages. So Yes, it's a bit of a strange thing to say. Softer employment figures seen as a good thing, but in effect, with the central bank anyway, that's what it is.
Well, we say softer employment figures, but really, who would have thought a couple of years ago the unemployment figure would have a 3 in front of it? I remember years ago, and it was quite a few decades ago, it was thought that structural unemployment would be about 10%. That's what you needed to have a comfortable economy. But I think what we're saying here is that it's quite likely that interest rates have topped out, because the Reserve Bank is unlikely to need to raise them, barring a surprising event, something that comes out of the blue. And hopefully this is going to give consumers and the housing market a bit more certainty. Now, I know the big four banks have all cast their predictions for interest rates for the next year, and 3 of the 4 have suggested that interest rates are not going to go up anymore. The only one a bit out of sync is Alan Oster and the National Australia Bank's economists, who suggest there's going to be one more interest rate rise, probably in November this year. And then they're all suggesting that over time interest rates are going to start falling, but slowly. By the way, I don't think any of us are suggesting it's going to go back to anything like those wartime interest rates of the COVID era, Pete.
No. So, what happened with the inflation figures? Well, these were released towards the end of July, and actually it was really good news. Quarterly inflation slowed to just 0.8%, which was the lowest we'd seen since the third quarter of 2021. So if you think about that, you annualize 0.8%, that's only inflation of just over 3%. So that's a huge improvement. I think if you look at the annual figures, the monthly inflation indicator fell to 5.4%. And looking ahead to next quarter, we've actually, if you look at the annual figures, which of course take into account figures from a year earlier, there's 2 very big quarters still to drop off those annual figures. So the annual inflation figure will start to drop 5%, 4%. Now, whether we can get it right down into the band, 2 to 3%, that last little bit could prove hard. There's some stickiness. You might have noticed fuel prices going back up.
Yeah.
There's things like power bills, energy prices. I think also if anyone who's renewed an insurance bill recently, they're up about 14% over the year. And rents are still rising in some parts of the country as well. So, yeah, I think we'll get down close to the 2 to 3% band. Whether they can nudge it down, and that could take a bit longer. But as you said, if you look at what financial markets are pricing, a terminal cash rate now at under 4.25%. So pretty much where we are at 4.1. Would we get another hike? Possibly, but you'd have to see some deterioration, I guess, in the outlook for that to happen for inflation. So, yeah, look, nobody knows for sure. The big four banks haven't exactly covered themselves in glory with some of the forecasts over the past year or so. And the same could be said of May too. So, yeah, lots can change and can change quickly, but it does look like we're pretty close to the top now.
Well, interestingly, another set of forecasts that have changed over the last little while is the various banks who only earlier this year, Pete, was suggesting that property values are going to crash. National Australia Bank changed its housing forecasts a couple of months ago, Westpac 2 weeks ago, ANZ a couple of days before we recorded this podcast, and they've all come to the party a little bit late, stuff that you and I know with our teams on the ground in the property markets. We felt that the property market changed early this year. Depends which state you're in and what segment of the market you're looking at. There's been 5-6 months of rising property prices, and now all the banks are suggesting that that's going to happen for a couple of years. So it's all good news for property investors. But having said that, despite the last RBA announcement when interest rates didn't go up, in general, consumer confidence actually hasn't risen. I think many people are still nervous. They're still uncertain, Pete.
Yes, consumer confidence. I mean, you could argue it's actually, what do consumer confidence figures really mean? I think sometimes if you look at the sub-components of that index, they're more useful. So I think people looking at time to buy a dwelling, people are still very cautious and a little bit nervous, I suppose, about transacting on property. But actually, house price expectations have absolutely rocketed back, and they're still rising even now. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of people just very nervous, very cautious. I think a lot of fixed rate mortgages still resetting. We're only about halfway through that process. So there's still probably quite a few portfolio investors who racked up a number of sort of poor quality properties or some regional properties that they're looking to sell potentially as interest rates reset higher. So yeah, there's still some nervous consumers out there, but I don't think we're seeing much in the way of mortgage arrears. If you look at what the banks have been reporting, still under 1% really for 90-day arrears. So it's mainly going to be showing up in things like slower retail. If you go to the shops, you'll see more discounting. Notice some of the car manufacturers looking to discount their stock to get rid of it. But people aren't really defaulting on their mortgages, but you might just see some more people looking to sell. And we're definitely seeing that in some of the regional parts of the country.
Well, you mentioned about the mortgage cliff, the fixed rate cliff a minute ago, Pete, and it seems like we're working our way through this. Just to remind people, that's the concept where a lot of people took fixed rate loans at very low interest rates a couple of years ago, but they took them for 2 or 3 years, and they're now coming out, and people who paid 1.5%, 2 and a bit percent are now going to have to pay double that. It's estimated there's $350 billion worth of loans that are moving from fixed rate to the more expensive variable interest rates. But as you said, it seems like we've worked our way through things and people are just coping with it. Some have already refinanced. Many had quite some cash buffers to see them through these challenging times. Others had paid their mortgages in advance. In other words, they kept paying their mortgage rates at the rates they were before interest rates dropped or as interest rate drops were falling. So there aren't a lot of mortgagee sales at the moment, Pete.
No, not at all. Distressed sales have actually been very low and falling. So yeah, I guess we're about halfway through that 350 billion resetting. But you and I have both been around long enough, Michael, to know that a change in the mortgage rate doesn't cause people to default on their mortgage or sell. What does potentially change the equation is if people don't have a job. So at the moment, unemployment, it's off the 50-year low, but it's still very low, set at 3.7%. If the unemployment rate was to rise to near 5%, then that might be a slightly different story. So yes, people are cutting back on their spending, but CBA in particular did report, well, yes, they're probably about halfway through this fixed rate reset. And yes, I mean, 90-day arrears, 0.4%. So not a lot happening there just yet. I think like a lot of these risks, when they're known about a year in advance and the media headlines are there, month after month after month, fixed rate cliff, mortgage cliff. I remember the fiscal cliff in the US years and years ago, and then closer to home, the interest-only cliff, which was apparently going to wreck or send a wrecking ball through the market. Well, the interest-only loans went from 40% of the market to near 10%, and the world kept turning. So yeah, look, we're only about halfway through. Yes, there will be some forced sellers who are over-leveraged. Some people will choose to offload a property or two if their cash flow isn't up to scratch. But I don't think it's going to be the end of the world scenario that people tend to sort of promote a little bit.
Yeah, there's one other thing I'd like to have a bit of a chat with you about. That I remember at Wealth Retreat when we were there together, our good friend Simon Kirstenmacher discussed this as well. And I heard you and Chris Bates talk about this on your Australian Property Investor podcast, which I enjoy listening to as well. It's the transfer of wealth that's going to happen, the significant transfer of wealth as baby boomers eventually start, well, unfortunately, dying off and transferring the wealth that they've got to the future generations. It's just, it depends who you speak to. McCrindle have done some forecasts on this. Banks have, others have as well, suggesting that there's going to be a significant transfer of wealth when baby boomers die. But the other trend that's happening at the moment, Pete, is we're not waiting to die. I know I've helped my kids into accommodation. The Bank of Mum and Dad is well known to help other people as well. This is one of the things that's going to help continue our property markets improving, but it's also going to create a bit of or increase the wealth inequality. The rich are going to get richer.
Yes. So the baby boomer generation is about a quarter of the Australian population, but they own over half of the wealth. This tends to attract a lot of criticism, snarky comments in the media. But I think it's worth remembering, well, firstly, not every baby boomer is wealthy. If you think about people, well, I look at sort of my parents, for example, born in the post-war years when there was still rationing all the way through till the mid-1950s in their case. There was no expectation at all that they would ever accumulate this much wealth over their lifetime. So And as they never tire of reminding us, very high interest rates. We had some brutal recessions. A lot of them ended up separating, divorcing. So, yeah, it's not an evenly spread wealth, but nevertheless, there is a huge wealth transfer coming. About 3 trillion or so, maybe 3.5 trillion, depending on which measure you take.
Now, remember, Pete, sorry to interrupt you. This is because many of them own their home now with no mortgage. And well, they don't have a lot of super because superannuation wasn't around when baby boomers started working. They actually have got some other assets as well, but it's mainly in their residential real estate, isn't it?
That's right. And I think if you actually look at where those, where the wealth is accumulated, it's not evenly spread across the country. It's the usual suspect suburbs that pop up high on the list: Vaucluse, Rose Bay, Watsons Bay, Toorak down your way. So, yeah, of course, it's not spread evenly across the country or across even cities. But nevertheless, this is going to be the biggest intergenerational wealth transfer in the history of Australia. Ultimately, it has to go to younger generations. And as you said, you don't want to be sort of the richest person in the graveyard. It's much more useful if baby boomers can pass on some of their wealth to younger generations. And there's different ways you can go about that. Our good friend Stuart Weems at Pro Solution has written a few articles on this over the years. There's sort of better and worse ways that you might go about it. But as you said, if you can bring forward the inheritance and actually pass on some of your wealth when it's actually useful to younger people, that's potentially a really good thing. You know, it can actually help, as you said, guide your offspring to greater wealth, better responsibilities. Yeah, just give them a leg up, I suppose, at what's not always an easy time.
Well, that's happening in a number of ways. And we recently had a podcast with Ken Race where we discussed this. And one way is that I know that a lot of people are letting their adult children live at home longer while saving a deposit. I know that's exactly what my sister has done with her kids. Others are helping them by giving a deposit, going guarantor for loans, co-investing with them. But there's challenges around that and problems with whose money is it if the family splits up. So before you do this, get some smart advice on how to protect your assets. But I agree with you, no fun being the richest person in the grave. And I'm getting pleasure seeing my kids enjoy the life that I would have liked to have at their age, and even helping them with the grandkids' school fees. Boy, that gets very expensive. But I think you're homeschooling, and so you don't have that big expensive school fees, Pete.
I've managed to dodge them so far. I'm winning that battle, but yeah, it might change when I get to high school. So so far, so good. But yeah, there's actually wrote a book on this some years ago, Wealth Ways for the Young, because when I became a parent, you know, I'd heard all this stuff. Yeah, you know, you need to teach your kids good habits and stuff. But I was thinking, yeah, the world's changed. You know, they don't use cash anymore. Everything's online and there's internet shopping. I mean, there's some really good principles you can instill in your children, drawing a strong association between work and earning. I think when it comes to saving a deposit, a matching concept can be good. So your offspring can buy into that process of saving the deposit, and then you can help by matching. So there's lots of different things you can do. I think the one thing, as you said, you really must sort out is the structure, because if you get that wrong, it's really hard to undo later on.
Well, I heard somebody clever once say it's not what you leave your kids, but it's what you leave in your kids that helps. So being a good money mentor is a great idea. Now, Pete, as always, I've enjoyed our chat, and I enjoy getting your daily musings on Twitter as well as your daily emails. But maybe you could just tell people, if they're wanting to find out a bit more about you, how to follow you.
Yeah, there's a few different places. PeteWargent.com, I suppose, is my homepage. But my daily blog, Pete Wargent Blogspot, is probably the easiest way to track me down. And as you said, social media as well, at Pete Wargent on Twitter, where we talk a little bit about the football and cricket, as well as what's happening in property and the economy.
Yes, there's been quite a bit of sport in there, but people can flick through that. And it's not even called Twitter anymore, is it? It shows how old you are, Pete. What do we call it now? It's X. And you don't tweet, you post.
For as long as it's around, I'm on there. Yes.
Fantastic.
But, yeah, it changes. These things change pretty quickly, but we try to keep up.
Thank you. Look forward to catching up with you in a month again, when you'll be in Australia, back home here.
I will be around September, October. I'm actually speaking at a few live events, the Rask Roadshow. So if you're around the traps, we go to a number of sort of regional parts of the country: Newcastle, Port Macquarie, down in Victoria, regional Vic. So yeah, if you're around over the next few weeks, keep an eye out, and good value tickets if you want to come along and have a yarn.
Well, I actually had a look at that. The prices are very cheap for going along, considering that you're providing some food and drinks. Yeah, I think that's a good idea to actually catch up with you face to face.
Yeah, fantastic. Always good.
Look forward to seeing you in a month. Bye.
Pleasure. Thanks, Michael. Bye.
I hope you enjoyed my chat with Pete, and I guess the message was there's very little that's going to change in the next year or two that's going to change the housing shortage that's pushing up property values and rentals. Oh, by the way, before we get on to the next chat I want to have with you, if you enjoyed our chat but you don't currently follow or subscribe to this podcast, just stop for a second, click the little follow button or subscribe button on your podcast app so that twice a week you get this type of information delivered to you. But I guess what we were saying was the Talkfest really isn't going to translate to more construction or encouraging more investors into the market. So all I can see is rising property values where the supply and demand ratio is in favour of the owners of property and also of tenants. Now, sure, one of the things we didn't discuss with Pete is that there were some changes to tenancy or recommendations to changes of tenancy legislation in the Labor Party Talkfest, but nothing that I'd be concerned about as a landlord. So what does this mean for you? Are you going to get into the property markets? How long are you prepared to wait? Now, you know that normally at this stage of the show I tell you how my team at Metropole can help you as a property investor, but I also want to remind you that we have a special home buying service. So whether you're looking at upgrading, right-sizing or buying your first home this year, why not have a chat with my team at Metropole? Because we have our specialist teams in Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane that help home buyers as well. Now, if you are looking at upgrading your home, you're probably wondering, is it the right time? Should you buy? Should you wait? Should you buy first? Should you sell first? What's ahead? How do I know what to pay? These are some of the same questions investors ask as well. So whether you're interested in getting the right team on your side for a home or an investment purchase, why not consider my team at Metropole? Remember, we're much more than buyer's agents. We sure have Australia's largest buyer's agency, but we have the backup of a significant research department and the frameworks I've fine-tuned over 5 decades, and we've been helping with clients with now for, well, over 2 decades, helping them safely grow into generational wealth. Go to metropole.com.au and we'd love to be part of your ongoing wealth creation journey.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In today's mindset message, I want to talk a bit about failure. Now, I know this podcast is about success, and it's interesting how in the mindset messages I talk about failure a bit. But if you're honest, you're going to fail. We've all failed. We're all going to have problems. We're all going to do things that don't work out. So let's start with the truth. In life, you are going to fail. A lot. In fact, if you don't fail, you'll never reach the level of success that you're capable of attaining. Talk to any successful person, somebody who's not trying to sell you one of those get-rich-quick schemes, and they're going to tell you that they've failed often. In fact, they're likely to say, I've failed way more than I've succeeded. I remember reading Michael Jordan, the famous basketball player, saying, I've missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games, 26 times. I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot and I've missed. I've failed over and over and over again in my life. And that's why I succeed. Now, we could go on and on about these sort of quotes because they're the truth. But what's sad is that many people believe if they fail, they're a failure. No, the only failure isn't giving up. Of course, this doesn't mean keep beating yourself about the head when something doesn't work out. It means you've got to adjust and keep moving forward to the destination that you've set for yourself. Notice I didn't say to change your destination. I said to adjust your plan. So here's the counterintuitive key to success. Fail forward fast. If you're struggling right now because you've experienced a set of setbacks, dust yourself off and get back at it. One step closer to getting where you want to be. That's what's going to happen. And if you're riding a wave of success and you haven't failed at anything recently, ask yourself if you've become complacent or maybe a little bit afraid. Maybe you're afraid to stretch your boundaries or to try something new. Maybe you're doing that because you're worried about the possibility of it not working. So as I've often said, I'm a real success at failure, and so should you be. Keep getting up one more time and you'll be ahead of the game. Well, thanks for spending the last little while with me, and I hope you got some benefit from this show. If you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there's 3 little buttons down the bottom. Press it and share it, or just tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you'll definitely be doing me a favour and helping me in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. Now, there's ways of catching up with me between these shows. Just look for Michael Yardney on social media, or why not join my private Facebook group? Go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And I have a way of saying thank you to you for subscribing to this podcast. Go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where you can get a bunch of ebooks and reports. My way of saying thank you. And when you've got time, why not listen to some of the old podcasts? There's individual lessons in each of those that I think would be helpful for you. I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?